Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dario from Next Pharma Summit. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to a brand new patient webinar with an interesting title, Nothing About Us Without Us, Impact of COVID-19, the Patient's Perspective. We have five incredible panelists today. I would like to, first of all, start this webinar with some sad news. So please, Liz, can you maybe introduce your colleague Michael Ceres, who was one of the patients, visionaries, and leaders who passed away last week. Liz, can you maybe share with us some thoughts about Michael?
Yes, thank you, Dario. Michael was somebody who was truly inspirational, and he certainly inspired me and gave me a helping hand when I was starting out on this patient engagement journey and didn't really know what to do or how it might work. And I spoke to him after one of his talks in a meeting and said, I'm really not quite sure. I want to do this stuff, but I don't know what or how. And he said, let me come and talk, let me come and speak at a meeting, let me help you organizing that meeting. And I think he has inspired so many people in different ways, whether they be patients with stomas or whether they be people in the patient engagement community. He was originally diagnosed with Crohn's disease age 12, and since then he's beaten cancer 3 times and survived 2 transplants. And he was the 11th person in the UK to undergo a small bowel transplant. And he really led the way. He got his physicians to have calls on Skype from the end of the bed. He invented a device to measure stoma filling that has benefited so many people, and founded a company, a device company, to market it. So his impact through that company and through the work that we're doing in patient engagement lives on. And it is very, very sad to hear of his untimely death, age 51. But I think important that we remember what a great guy he was, and that he will continue to live as an inspiration in our hearts as we go on with patient engagement. Gabriella.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for that remembrance of Michael. We appreciate it. So to kick us off, hi everyone, my name is Gabriella Salvatore. I am the moderator for today's session. I'm from a company called Vantage Partners, which is a strategy and management consulting firm. And what we'd like to do to kick us off is ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and then answer the question, what does nothing for us without us mean to you? With a brief explanation as to their thoughts. So Jane, can I ask you to start us?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jane Leahy. I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia in 2014. I underwent a stem cell transplant in 2016, and later on that year, I became a patient ambassador for Blood Cancer UK. They had picked up on the blogs I'd been writing as I went through my treatment, and they asked me to join a new initiative they had of recruiting patient ambassadors. So in that role, I give talks about my experience as a patient to help raise awareness and funds for the charity. And I'm also a patient representative on the UK AML working group, and I'm a member of the AML clinical trials, I'm a patient representative on a number of the trials that they're currently running. And I'm also a member of the Blood Cancer UK policy panel, which aims to put the patients really at the centre of decisions that are made by the government and the NHS in the UK.
Great, wonderful.
In terms of answering the question, nothing about us without us, I really want to turn that around and say, well, how would you feel if people were making decisions about your treatment that would ultimately affect your quality of life and even your capacity to continue living, and you had no say in that?
Yeah, thank you. Liz, would you like to introduce yourself and answer the question?
So I'm Liz Clark. I'm Vice President of Medical Affairs at Norgine, and I run Norgine's patient engagement activities. And for me, nothing about us without us is something that we need to keep front in mind. It's a catchy phrase, and I think Jane's point is absolutely right. It's very easy to get carried away in planning what we're going to do and actually forget that the people that we need to be co-creating with might not be in that group. Jane is part of our Norgine's group, which is great, and Trishna's also worked with us on activities, but we constantly need to do that because otherwise we forget.
That's great. Thank you. Trishna.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tristan Barodia. I'm a health advocate and patient engagement advisor living with multiple sclerosis, amongst several other long-term physical and mental health conditions. I have over a decade of experience within the area of advocacy and patient engagement. I do a variety of different things, such as consultancy, speaking at events, internal meetings and conferences, media work, co-creation of services, resources and events. I review a lot of patient-facing documents, content and information, and I also write lots of articles and blogs. Now, I work with multiple stakeholders, and that includes pharma, CROs, medcoms agencies, the third sector, industry bodies, and also healthcare systems. For me, nothing about us without us really means that it's had to go throughout the entire healthcare system. We need to get patients involved from concept through to realization. It's about first identifying what the unmet needs are and then engaging with patients from the very start in a transparent, relevant and appropriate way to produce what will be targeted and more relevant products, services and resources. I often see, for example, projects and even, for example, conferences being touted as being patient-centric. But if you ask, well, is there a patient who is part of the project team, for example, or part of the speaking faculty, or have you engaged with the patient in order to produce this resource or this tool? And quite often the answer is no. So I'm really looking forward to having a lively discussion today while my headphones fall out. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Welcome, Trishna. Sheila, can we come to you? Oh, I think you might be on mute, Sheila. Oh,
can you hear me?
Now we can. Yep.
Yeah. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sheila. I'm an acromegaly patient for almost 20 years now. I've been involved in patient advocacy for about 7-8 years now. I started off at grassroots level. I'm based in Italy, so I was focused in my region, and then I started working with a national organization, and now I work with a global pituitary organization. Very much similar to Trishna, I've also been involved in consulting, moderating, chairing, and co-creating, which is, to me, the most valuable aspect as a patient advocate. And that leads me to what does that phrase mean? And I can sum it up in one word, which is co-creation. You can't do anything without us because you need us as much as we need you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Andy.
Thank you. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Andy Bowman. I'm the Managing Director of Within 3 in Europe. I'm 30 plus years in the business. And one of the things I think I've noted in every one of those 30 odd years is that each year apparently is an industry and sector we're getting more and more patient-centric, which I think is interesting as a concept. I always felt that patient centricity was binary. Either you were or you weren't. And much to Trishna's point, I think we're great as an industry about talking about it. We're very poor in terms of actually enacting it and delivering upon that promise. And I think there's some things that really haven't changed. And, we see the patient as a source of information, certainly kind of a drug target, maybe the basis of some kind of transactional type data mining exercise. I think in addressing the question, that the way to really kind of address the question is to stop seeing the condition, stop seeing the patient, start seeing the person, because these are people that we're dealing with. Everyone here, online will have a condition, of some or others. We've heard a lot, kind of already from the panelists. We've all got them. We're all patients, but ultimately we're all people, and we're all living with the conditions that we have. And I think one of the key points I think I've heard as well is that quite often treatment and healthcare is done to people, not considering what's important to them. And sometimes, just what we see as kind of the clinical symptoms are not in the least bit important to the people that we speak to. Mm-hmm. And I think that, in addressing the kind of question and the debate, the sooner that we start not only asking good questions, but more importantly, listening to the answers, the more able that we are to kind of truly engage with these patients that we purport to be patients.
I would love to pick up on that concept of listening. So Liz, how can industry best listen for and to the needs of patients? What's the process there?
I think it's about listening to individual patients when we get the opportunity to do so. And if we haven't got an opportunity to make an opportunity, as Andy said, it's about people, and people relate to people. So one of the things that we've done at Norgine is to try to bring patients into the office. So we obviously have patients in the office because, as you said, we are patients. But I think people get to really identify with and understand people's issues when they see the individual who has whatever it is that we're producing therapy for, and understands how they use it, what it means to them, etc. And so one of my goals when I set up the project was that everybody working at Norgine would get to meet real patients who were people who were using the products that we were making, and hear directly from them, whatever part of the business that they worked in. And I think that human-to-human interaction means more than any amount of desk research. I think social listening is something else that we've done that is useful, but it isn't as real. And I think it's about understanding not somebody as a patient, but a person. And that really makes a difference.
Great, thank you. Trishna, let me ask a little bit about how you see, you mentioned working with lots of different stakeholders, and obviously one of those being industry, but can you say a bit about how you see differing levels of engagement with industry based on the type or the tier of advocate?
Yes, so traditionally, I've often seen industry sort of lumping all patients together into one group, the patients, and that's neither useful or reflective of the current situation, because A, we aren't all the same, and B, it creates an us and them situation, which again isn't helpful. The patient landscape is changing, and in my experience, there's now sort of three broad groups of patients, all who have varying characteristics, and that will determine how and when industry can interact with them sort of effectively. So first, which is the vast majority of people with a condition, you have what I call the patient by experience, and they're someone who knows about their experience with their condition, but sort of little else beyond that. So they don't really know much about the patient community or the issues affecting them. And then you have the expert patient, and they're knowledgeable about their own experience of their condition, but also the issues affecting their particular patient community. And they're generally very well informed. They're taking an increasingly active role in their healthcare. And then you have what I call the pro patient. And these are people who are not only experts in their own condition and also the issues affecting their own patient community, but they're looking beyond that, and they're looking to what I'd say is kind of disease agnostic issues like health literacy, like digital health, like the drugs development process, like patient engagement. And they're often highly knowledgeable, they're well connected with various stakeholders. And what I found is as you go up each level, the skills, the experience, expertise, and breadth of knowledge, it increases. So one person can actually be more than one type of patient. And what industry really needs to sort of think about and consider is the type of patient that they're engaging with. What will bring the most value to the project? When do you bring in certain types of patients at what point during the project timeline? So, you know, for example, if you're thinking of holding a focus group, then you could have a pro patient as part of the project team, so co-creating and developing that focus group to make sure that it's patient friendly, it's truly targeted, it's considerate of patient needs. But you would have patients by experience who are involved as participants. It wouldn't be suitable to have a patient by experience sitting on the project team because they wouldn't know anything beyond their own experience of the condition. They don't know about the issues affecting the patient community. They don't necessarily know about the various ins and outs of working with industry, because that also makes a difference as well. If you're going to, for example, have a patient sitting on the project team, they need to be experienced in working with industry so that they're aware of what is possible, what could be done, what restrictions or limitations there may be when it comes to, for example, guidelines, regulations, etc., etc. So it's about keeping all of that in mind, but thinking when you're starting a project, where are the flashpoints? Where are the points along that project timeline that you could actually engage with one type of patient? And it's something which industry, like Andy mentioned, industry is starting to do. Are we there yet? I don't think we are.
Great, thank you for that. So Jane, picking up on this idea of different levels of patient ambassadors, you really started out as a patient by experience and have evolved your role over the years. Can you say a little bit about that journey for yourself? And before you do, let me just invite our participants to enter any questions that they might have or chat any comments that they might like to share, and we'll be sure to bring those into the conversation as well. So Jane.
Yeah, so I'm quite new to this patient advocacy role. As I said, I was diagnosed in 2014, and I didn't really start any patient advocacy work until 2016, shortly after having my stem cell transplant. As I was going through my treatment, I was blogging on a blood cancer charity website, really for my own mental health. I think really I found it really useful to write down how I was feeling and what was happening to me. And the charity picked up on my blogs and asked if they could use them and publish them on their website, which they did, and then asked me to join this ambassador program. And I really had no idea where it was going to lead to or what it would involve. So they would come to me and say, you know, would you speak at this event? And I just said yes to everything. And I kind of feel like I've fallen down a rabbit hole, because each experience, each activity I've taken part in has led to something else. And then I work at Norgine, so Liz got wind of the fact that I was doing some patient advocacy work and said, well, you know, come join our program too. And so, you know, I've got involved in a few events with Liz as well, and it really has just kind of snowballed. And my involvement through the AML working group as well came about through a fellow ambassador at the charity, Blood Cancer UK, who said, well, I'm a patient representative on this clinical trials group. And he found out that I had benefited from a clinical trial that I had been a patient in, and I had a direct benefit. There's quite a nice story where I've met the doctor whose research led to my successful treatment. And the doctor is on that clinical trials working group. So my fellow ambassador said, well, you must come and meet him. And so I met him, and then was invited to join the working group, and then have been invited to be a patient representative on some new clinical trials. And it's really, I'm learning as I go. Every day is a new adventure and a new experience, and I feel I have a long way to go before I'm as experienced as Trishna and Sheila, but I'm enjoying the process of moving up from being I can't remember the first term you used, a patient with my own personal experience, to having a bit more expertise about the wider subject, and now learning about how industry works and how the pharma companies have to abide by the regulations whilst also trying to remember the patient at the heart of what they do.
There's a question from our audience about whether there's anyone who provides learning and development for a patient who wants to move through the 3 grades that Trishna mentioned. So I know there's Eurordis in Europe and Nord in North America who provide training for advocates. Is anybody else aware of training that can be accessed for a patient who'd like to move into advocacy?
So in terms of the specifically advocacy within clinical research, you have the WAPO Fellowship, which is a Europe-based program. I do think that there isn't enough training. I mean, Jane was talking about how it's, she's very much learning as she goes along. I'm pretty sure Sheila will probably, echo that. It was the same with me as well. There are groups where patient leaders come together and they share experiences, and I find that incredibly helpful, because right at the beginning, when I started working with industry, I was receiving contracts that I didn't understand. They were using terminology that I didn't understand. And part of you felt scared about asking questions because you didn't want to look like you were, you didn't know, or you were incompetent. Because as patients, we work so hard to be taken seriously and to be able to have conversations on the same level as everybody else in the room. And so often, I would go through, for example, these agreements, or I would, go and attend a meeting, and I hear all these acronyms, and I'd come home and frantically go through my notes and try and look up what all these acronyms mean. And so what I've been doing is I've actually been mentoring other patient advocates who are just starting out on that journey, because it's something I wish I'd had somebody to be able to ask those questions. And I think that's something which can really help. It's about sharing those experiences and making sure that as patient advocates, we're helping each other as well.
Yeah, that's great. Sheila, would you like to add?
Yeah, I'm thinking that it's been a learning curve for me since day one, and it will continue to be. It was my endocrinologist who proposed that I become involved in advocacy, and but the best part is talking to the various multi-stakeholders, because I've seen several times, so I've spoken at different events, and I've seen several times after expressing your thoughts or whatever, that their face sort of lights up, and it's like that aha moment, and that is the most satisfactory emotion for a patient, because that means that what I have communicated, it has gotten through, the message has gotten through, and that could eventually lead to a change in the corporate culture. It will take time, but that's important. And as far as resources for patients, I was thinking that even the patient organizations in the various disorders could be a good starting point, and they could then in turn direct you to other resources. It's a very much, you learn by yourself, and you learn by mistakes, you learn by throwing yourself in the deep end. Nobody teaches you how to speak at events. Not all patients are inclined to speak because they don't feel confident. and also because most of the conferences are in English. We are all speaking in English, but not all patients feel confident to express themselves in English. But yeah, so you have to teach yourself, find the resources, maybe by contacting somebody in a patient group, and then navigate your way through. Follow patient organizations on all the social media. Don't be afraid to ask questions, comment, and you just might find the right person to mentor you or to sort of offer you come on board. The most important thing is ask. Don't be afraid to ask. Everybody had to start somewhere. So
That's great. Thank you, Sheila. Andy, we're hearing a lot about the creation of a patient-to-patient community through mentoring, through asking questions, sharing experiences. How do you imagine a shared community between patients and industry being created?
I think it's about kind of recognizing that there are barriers, perfectly understandable barriers between those two ends of the spectrum, but certainly kind of two sides to that kind of community type coin. I think one of them, that the main one I understand kind of 100%, is that it's difficult for patients to engage with industry when they are still so in awe of the healthcare community, and doctors in particular. It's very difficult for them to feel comfortable in that kind of environment. So why would we think they'd be comfortable engaging with a huge, great behemoth of the pharmaceutical industry, for instance? I think it's too much of an ask. And I think, so it's recognizing that is a perfectly understandable barrier. And thinking, how can we then kind of reduce that? How can we kind of lessen that or lower that barrier? Certainly education helps. But I think certainly removing some of the pressure points as well, and trying to recognize that, again, to the concept that patients are people, as we all are, that by definition means we have whole lives to live outside of our condition, and other kind of pressure points kind of going on. So whatever kind of community we create has got to be mindful of those circumstances. So and an absolute kind of impact of the catalyst for this change of thinking is definitely kind of COVID-19. That maybe that kind of engagement can be done in this type of environment, can be done on our terms, so that people kind of logging on today, they've hopefully they're engaged by this conversation, but they've decided this is a time that suits them. Maybe they've got their slippers and a house coat on, and that's great, but it's very much on their terms, and I think that makes it comfortable. We clearly have a degree of anonymity going on here. You can't see kind of who you are right now. You might be able to maybe chatting to Gabriella right now, and that's great. And you should be able to kind of feel comfortable and safe and able to be able to contribute. So whatever community we come up with, it's got to create those circumstances where patients, people, it's convenient for them to contribute, but also they feel as if they're in a safe, non-judgmental environment where they're not afraid to ask the dumb question. And that's what you get in terms of, no one wants to appear like the fool when they're engaging with a pharmaceutical company or indeed a doctor. So we've got to try and create that environment where they feel that they are talking to people in exactly the same situation, that they can share those experiences, that we can learn from those experiences. And I think that's what a community really should be about, is making those barriers to kind of active engagement as low as we possibly can make them, which also means that both sides of that coin have to see value in that engagement as well. So I think to kind of Trishna's point, if I've just dwelt on the kind of the patient side of things for a while, coming from the industry point of view, it's, what are we trying to achieve with the engagement? Do we want actually patient experience? Then let's go to the patient by experience and let's listen to them, see what they've got to say. If we want to find out about a patient ecosystem, maybe then it's the next level up. Maybe it's the expert patient group we go to. And then if we want to tap into those you know, the broader kind of healthcare systems, the disease, you know, agnostic, as I think as Trishna kind of put it. Then again, we're looking at the professional patient. But again, I think as an industry, we need to be clear on what we want to get out of the engagement. Otherwise, we slip into old habits, which is to say, we've sent those materials to the healthcare professionals, tick. We've sent those materials to the patient, tick, job done. Well, it isn't job done.
Yeah, thank you. Trishna, there's a question in our chat for you, which is, how are the cultural implications of patient engagement going to be addressed? Does it work the same way in France as it might in Germany, for example?
So there are cultural differences. That's to do with not just the way that healthcare is set up and the way that, for example, healthcare professionals are seen, but also the way that people view chronic conditions as well, and also the structure of advocacy. How is that structured in a particular country? So, for example, in Eastern Europe, the advocacy structure is very much in its inception. The patient advocacy groups are very new and they're just finding their feet. So it can be a bit more difficult for individual patient advocates to find the support that they may need in order to do what it is that they want to do or to get their voice heard. In places like the United Kingdom, for example, the patient advocacy structure is very mature, it's very sophisticated. And so that brings about different areas in which the patient voice can be heard. There's also differences within the way that patient advocacy groups are seen by patients. So there are some countries where traditionally patient advocacy groups haven't necessarily been trusted or well liked by the patient community. And so again, this is something which traditionally industry has thought, if you go to a patient advocacy group, then they're going to be hearing the voice of the patient community. That's actually not necessarily true. And the patient advocacy group, in some countries, patient advocacy groups aren't well, they're not well attended, so to speak, by patients. So if you, I don't know, in multiple sclerosis, for example, just picking something because that's what I have, don't always assume that somebody with MS is a member of the National MS Society. The other thing about cultural differences is that, like I mentioned before, the way that chronic illness and being ill, the way that it's seen in different countries and different cultures can have an impact on whether or not somebody feels comfortable going into patient advocacy. So as you can see, I have an Asian heritage. So my heritage is Indian, and within the Asian community, chronic illness, disability, there's still a great deal of stigma and prejudice attached to it. And illness is often swept under the carpet, people don't talk about it. Now, if that's the kind of culture that somebody is living in, then that makes it very difficult for someone to say, well, I want to speak out publicly about living with my condition. I want to get involved with lobbying for whether it's better services, market access, etc., etc. So those cultural differences are there. I don't think it's something we should shy away from. I think it's something that we need to work with and bear that in mind when you're engaging, if you're from industry, if you're engaging with people from different cultures, different nationalities, just in the same way that it's important for healthcare professionals to do the same thing when they're engaging with patients.
Great. Jane, there's a question that's come through the chat about, has anyone experienced the training in the UK, especially in cancer? Anything that you can offer about what particularly goes on in the cancer community?
I wish I could, really. I'm not aware of any specific patient advocacy training for cancer patients. I really only know about the blood cancer community and in particular the charity I work with. that has organised some training sessions to help their patient ambassadors know how to kind of handle media work, for example. But it's quite immature and quite informal in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any other panelists want to add to that about experiences going through training?
So I think many of the patient groups do tend to provide, like as Jane mentioned, some sort of training, because if you, well, in the UK, at least, if you join as a volunteer for a patient organisation, often you have to go through some kind of training in order to become a volunteer, especially with the larger patient groups. And things like media training, depending on what it is that you're interested in. If you want to become a support volunteer, for instance, that often involves some training. And it's a good way to get started, because it can often allow you to develop skills that you may not otherwise be using in your day-to-day life. So my regular job, my full-time job, I don't have to give presentations. I don't have to read through contracts. I don't have to do many of the things that, and use a lot of the skills that I've developed within patient advocacy. I don't have to go on the radio and give an interview, or go on the television and give an interview. Those are all things which I have to do as part of my advocacy work and skills I've had to develop. And those patient advocacy groups are a really good starting point for developing some of those skills.
Mm-hmm. Sheila, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to go back 1 second, then I'll say something about this. First time I was face to face with a group of industry stakeholders, I felt I was a little house in front of a skyscrapers. And when we started to talk to each other, etc., at the end they asked our opinion of how the session went. And I said, well, I realized that you guys are human beings. So this is the perception of a patient who is just starting out, talking to the industry. You don't know how to relate to these people. And so you see, it's a bit like bumping into your teacher in the supermarket, and you go, what are you doing here? And they say, well, I have to eat too. It's the sudden realization that they are human beings just like us. And going back to the training, and the differences, as a global organization, so I represent the World Alliance of Pituitary Organizations. So we bring together patient organizations, not individuals. And we see that the training in some countries is not just based on the patients, but even the doctors lack training. And so it is the combination of the two things. Yes, patients can be trained by joining a patient advocacy group, which by the way, the stuff we needed to know 5 years ago to be an advocate has changed completely. We now also have to be able to be the social media guru. You have to follow everybody, you have to reply, you have to do, and you have to keep up with it. So some skills can be taught on the books, some skills are soft skills, and some skills, well, you just say, well, right, I can float, I'm gonna throw myself in the deep end and see how it goes. That's the way it is. You're like every day at work, there's not a single day that is the same. The tasks you do may be the same, but every day you have to face something different. And it's the same thing in the advocacy world. And we're not only advocates, but we also have to manage our own disease.
So there's a question in the chat, and Liz, I'm going to start with you if you don't mind. The question is there more to the work than public speaking or commenting on documents? And so I would say from the industry perspective, Liz, you know, what are the other creative or imaginative ways you have partnered with patient advocates? And then we'll obviously come to the advocates and ask you as well. But Liz, if you want to start us off.
I think actually, to Sheila's point, it is about being prepared to jump in and join in, and also understand that sometimes the people that you're joining in with don't actually have a lot more experience than you do. It was certainly the way that we started off, and it is about people meeting people and doing something together. So I think I would say be prepared to help people shape what they're doing. And Trishna has done that certainly with us, but from, you know, obviously a huge background of experience. But, you know, be prepared to go, I'd love to help you. I'm not sure how, but let's talk about what we want to achieve. And I think by focusing on what we want to achieve together, it enables people to contribute the best that they can contribute. And that helps both sides grow in the equation. So I come with you, Sheila. I say, you know, jump in the deep end and accept that you can float and maybe paddle a bit in various directions that you've not anticipated.
Yep. So let me ask the patient advocates on the line, Sheila, Jane, and Trishna. There's a question, an additional question from the group wanting to know, do you think that the patient groups could ever be replaced by patient advocates, or could there be some form of merger? Thoughts about that?
I don't think one is ever going to be replaced by the other. They both have value, and they both have their varying areas of strengths. And to be honest, I don't think it would be beneficial for the healthcare industry, healthcare system, for them to eventually merge. So I'll give you an example that if you're a patient group, by virtue of being an organisation, you will have your own agenda. That goes without saying. But you also tend to have more resources than an individual patient advocate. You represent the voice of the entire patient community in theory. You also have often have the ability to be able to connect with some stakeholders that might be slightly more out of reach to the individual patient advocate. So, for example, within government, policymakers, etc., etc. Whereas the individual patient advocate often has more independence to be able to say what they think. They're often able to give specific experiences and also give the voice of the patient community that may not be represented by that, by that patient group. There's also different ways of working. So if you're working with a patient group or you're working with an individual patient advocate in your industry, then there's different ways of working. And again, that makes a difference. The other thing which I think is really important to remember is that not everyone who works or represents patient groups necessarily have lived-in experience of that particular disease. So an individual patient advocate often brings those things together. And it's not that one is better than the other. That's really not the case. It's about you need to recognize what each one brings to the table and bring them in together.
And Jane or Sheila, what publications or websites does the panel recommend for anyone looking for examples of patient involvement in co-production? Are there recommendations you would make for reading material? That was a question from the audience.
Not off the bat. I'd have to think about it.
Okay, great.
I think you, yeah, I can't think of something off the bat.
No problem.
I think Sheila nailed it the first time. It's social media. You meet so much stuff in social media, in the social space, that actually that in itself is its own education in a lot of the parts of it and enables you to follow people. I would say Twitter is a great place to follow a lot of the conversations. The BMJ has a patient blog, and there's you start reading that and you read every link you were interested in, you wouldn't do anything else all day. You know, I think that's quite useful if there's nothing formal.
And also, what's also useful is just ask. So some of the things that I've done, I've advised companies on how they're engaging with patients and their patient engagement strategies and what projects they could bring patients in and co-create. So if you're looking for advice on how do you go about co-creating, talk to the people who are doing it. That, you know, that makes sense. If there's formal obviously out there. Just I want to go back to one of the questions which was asked previously, which I'm not sure whether we gave any concrete examples. Somebody asked what examples are there of working with patients beyond the sort of the traditional just getting patient insights and, you know, reviewing of content. So some of the projects that I've really enjoyed are the ones where companies are really thinking outside the box and they're really embedding the patient voice into what they're doing. So with Liz at Norgine, we actually co-created an entire patient engagement workshop, and I helped put that workshop together. So it wasn't that Norgine decided we're going to put on a patient engagement workshop. We're going to set the agenda. We're going to decide what to talk about. We're going to decide who to ask. We're going to decide what we want people what the sessions to be, and then we'll ask a patient expert to come in and talk about it. It was true co-creation. You know, I was involved along with another patient advocate with the actual development of that workshop. Likewise, I've done executive production on non-branded awareness campaigns. I've, like I said, advised companies on patient engagement strategies, helped co-develop patient support programs. It's really anything that you're thinking of doing for a patient, then think about, can we get a patient involved in actually doing that? Some companies are now putting together what are known as sort of patient advisory councils or patient advisory boards, but they are sort of long-term engagements whereby they're getting together groups of patients to help advise them and help guide them, make sure that they are being patient focused. There's lots and lots of opportunities out there. It's just sometimes what happens is, because it's traditionally not something that has been done, it gets forgotten about. So whatever it is that you're working on, you know, if you go back to your desk, well, I say go back to your desk, most of us are working from home, but if you're at your desk tomorrow morning and you're you know, looking at a project that you've got to develop, think about, how can I get a patient involved? Another key area is also industry is often asked to speak at conferences or congresses, or they run satellite symposia at medical and scientific conferences. If, as a company, you've been asked to speak at a session, think about, if you brought a patient with you to that session, obviously consider the type of patient, because, you know, some conferences and congresses aren't suitable for a patient by experience, but would it add value to that session? I've often co-presented with companies at conferences because they believe that it will bring value to co-present with an expert patient or a pro patient. And so it's about thinking, how have we always done things? Could we get a patient involved? There's lots of ideas out there. So, you know, just be creative.
Yeah. So I want to just offer, there's one answer that's come through on the chat to the question about programs in the UK in the cancer space, and I want to make sure that we offer that information out. So the UK has the NCRI in cancer and NIHR in all diseases, and both provide training in the disease, and both provide training. In the NCRI, it is led and designed by professional patients, and the training is about involvement with researchers to encourage co-production. So those are a couple of resources that have come through Sheila, did you want to say something? It sounded like I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, I was thinking that a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, talking about opportunities, I signed up to attend a pharmacovigilance event, a very well-known one in the Netherlands, and I was very much looking forward to it because I said, right, this is about safety. I'm sure I'm going to have a lot of patient colleagues there. First time I went there, I think I was, maybe you could count them on one hand, if that, out of 300 participants. And my first reaction was, okay, I'm in the wrong place. And then I said, no, I'm in the right place at the right time. And I raised the issue with the organizers and at the round tables on patients. And the next year they invited me to co-chair a roundtable. So out of complaining and raising an issue, as in how dare you talk about patient safety and drug safety without the end users, came an opportunity. And then also, for example, right now I'm involved in the publication of lay summaries. That's a hot topic now, because there's a new EU regulation that states that all clinical trials must have a lay summary within 1 year of the results. And that could be tiered down to different levels of patient experience. You need all 3 different levels depending what the publishing house or the industry company wants. Do you want a less experienced patients because of what we're labeling ourselves as, to look at the lay summary and, okay, this is good for the community? Or do you want a more experienced advocate who can actually review the lay summary that has been prepared and determine whether that is appropriate for the community or not? Or do you want the professional who, through experience and skills gained throughout the years, whether by chance or because they've actually trained themselves, is able to contribute and co-author something? That doesn't mean that the let's say the more experienced advocate cannot contribute to a paper, but you need specific skills to do that, right? And remember that the patient group or patient centered group acts as a bridge between the community behind them and the industry in front of them, because they are in a very fortunate position where they understand both sides. It's like being an interpreter. Tristan and I know what we're talking about. We both have the same professional background. And so we can listen to the industry, interpret what they need, and convey that to the community, and vice versa. And that's a precious, very, very precious position for both sides.
There's an interesting question in the chat about those who are engaging in Twitter and other things are of the quote chattering classes and are highly engaged patients. And the question is, are those highly engaged patients representative of the larger community or not? So Jane, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do actually. It's something that I always emphasize, that I can talk about my own experience, and it's very different from a lot of other patients that even have the same condition as me, let alone other types of blood cancer. That, you know, the variety of conditions and the way it affects your life are vastly different, and I can't possibly represent everybody. So I feel that I need to be a voice amongst many others, and that my view counts and my opinion counts, but that I need to have other patients alongside me giving their side of the story and their experience as well. And that's where, going back to what Trishna was talking about, the value of an individual patient or patient organizations. So the patient organisations can collate the information from a wide variety of sources and present that to industry. And whilst this overview is very important for industry to understand, having the individual story and seeing the human aspect of particular stories is also just as important. So I really think that you need the balance of both.
Yep. There's a question in the chat about whether there are patients who are speaking on behalf of others, but without an adequate foundation or an evidence base. And it sounds like that could possibly be happening, and you're also taking steps against that. Is that a fair response?
I think so. I think you need to be careful that if you're talking to an individual, that you also have the backing of a patient organisation who can I can't think of the right term, but can kind of back up what they're saying or give a bit more foundation to a specific issue that's being discussed.
Yeah.
And I think also it's really important to, sorry, I think it's really important in that case to know what the credentials are of those individual patients. Because, so for example, myself, Sheila, yes, we're individual patient advocates, but we also work with the patient groups as well. So I do a lot of what I say grassroots and ground level work with various patient associations, particularly in the area of multiple sclerosis, because that's one of the conditions that I live with. So it's really important to also to check the credentials of that individual patient advocate. When people chat with me, when people chat with Sheila, if we talk about the community, then that person that we're talking to has a pretty good idea that what we're saying is actually representative of the community because we work with the community. Whereas, if there are lots of people who are on social media now, it's one of the good things about social media, who go on social media and talk about their condition and their disease, may claim to represent the views of the patient community, but if you delve deeper, you find actually they don't work with patient groups, they don't do any sort of like working with the charities, etc., etc. So then you kind of know, well, are they actually representing the views of the patient community? Probably not. So I think that's really important, just the same way that it's important in any aspect of life or work life to check those credentials.
Great. So in our last 3 minutes, Andy, let me start with you as a way of closing out our time today. What is your thought on what the future of patient engagement will look like?
I hope better than it's been to date, because the need for people engagement has never been more important than it is right now. Because what the COVID-19 situation has highlighted is that we've been far too dependent on those face-to-face type transactional type relationships. I'll have a meeting to derive some information or some data from this group. I want to identify an advocate who's going to speak on our behalf. That's not going to happen now. I think what is important, I think, is that those engagements are continuous and they are ongoing, and they continue to offer value throughout the entire kind of timeline. And it doesn't need to be kind of a formalized community, but there's got to be kind of two-way dialogue. There has to be. And it has to be through some kind of virtual forum, in addition to those wonderful relationship building opportunities as face-to-face and so on. It just has to be. Without that, there is no ongoing people engagement. It's critically important.
Great. Jane, future of patient engagement, what will it be like?
Yeah, I think Andy's nailed it really. Organizations need to make more use of this kind of virtual technology. It's such an easy way of keeping in touch with people and canvassing a wide group of people all around the world virtually now. There are no barriers, there's no boundaries. So we've got to seize this technology and run with it.
Great. Sheila?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that the ECRD conference that took place a few weeks back was a perfect example of how a virtual conference made it possible for participants from all over the part. I think there were a lot more participants.
Oh, Sheila, I think we're losing connectivity.
Been done physically.
Yep.
So on the one side you have, can you hear me?
No, we're losing you, Sheila. I'm going to ask Liz to start kind of
Can you hear
sharing
me?
your thoughts.
Go ahead, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, I'm kind of completing a circle here because Michael Sears told us to go for things we thought were worthwhile and to be courageous. So I think we need to keep doing those things. And if we do, the future we build will be better.
Yeah, thank you. And Trishna, final words on the future of patient engagement.
So I think particularly coming out of this pandemic, it's become increasingly obvious that everyone has the potential to be a patient at some point in their lives. So everybody, doesn't matter where in the healthcare system you are, we all have a vested interest in getting patient engagement right and making sure that it happens. It's not that it's a nice thing to do, but it's a necessary part of the healthcare journey. And it doesn't matter which part of the healthcare journey we're talking about, whether it's drugs development, whether it's better services, whether it's access to healthcare professionals, we all have that vested interest. It's going to be about being creative. It's going to be about working together. And I think it's most importantly, it's about changing those mindsets that, like I said, it's not just a nice thing to do. It's something that has to happen. And in order for it to be relevant and targeted and focused, it's exactly what the title of this webinar is. It's nothing about us without us. And that has to be the mantra that leads the industry into the future.
Wonderful. Well, we want to thank everyone who attended today, and also thank you so much to our panelists. It was fantastic to hear your perspectives. We did not get to all of the questions. We apologize for that, but thank you so much for your robust participation. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.